Happy New Year, DoD Innovators. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I am Captain Ashley Hollingsworth, Chief of the Directors Action Group at the Department of the Air Force CDAO. As your host, I am thrilled to be a part of this month's Innovation Connect. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you are not a presenter, please keep your camera off and your microphone on mute. If someone has a live microphone while our speaker is presenting, please allow the moderators to mute that microphone. We have had a few instances lately of attendees inadvertently muting the speaker. Allowing our moderators to handle the issue will help us avoid this mistake. Also, please limit your questions to today's topic and avoid media-related inquiries or commercial-like promoting. Finally, your questions for the speaker can be submitted through the chat. Today's webinar will spark awareness and dialogue about the latest developments in artificial intelligence across the Department of Defense. Our panel of distinguished guests will discuss the AI Bill of Rights framework and other initiatives crucial for ethical AI deployment, with an emphasis on importance of developing and using AI in a manner that is transparent, accountable, and adheres to principles of fairness and privacy. Our moderator, Mr. Tom Suder, is a respected thought leader in the federal IT community and founder and president of the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, ATARC. He will guide a panel of 5 experts who will discuss a deeper understanding of responsible AI practices, ensuring that AI advancements align with ethical standards and public interest. Without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed speakers. Our 5 panelists include Mr. Tom Sasala, the Deputy Director at the U.S. Army Office of Enterprise Management. Mr. Sasala leads organization-wide operational initiatives and assists the Director in managing the Army Business Mission Area portfolio. He also directly supports the Undersecretary of the Army with essential enterprise metrics spanning a wide range of functional and mission-oriented performance indicators, and works closely with the Army Chief Information Officer and Chief Data and Analytics Officer to manage defense business systems, master business data, and provide oversight of business system investments. Prior to joining the Department of the Navy, Mr. Sasala served as Director, Army Architecture Integration Center, and Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Army. Second, Mr. Tony Boese is a Presidential Management Fellowship alumnus, currently serving as the Research Programs Manager and performing research at the National Artificial Intelligence Institute. Mr. Boese runs operationally complex interagency efforts to apply AI to mental and brain health, workforce assessment, education, and development. He works with points across government on AI and data policy and ethics. Before government, he was an academic, researching and teaching primarily in public policy, ethics, comparative religions, and coaching debate. Mr. Boese holds 5 degrees and 2 graduate certificates, loves teaching and tabletop gaming, and is always very excited to exchange perspectives and ideas with new faces. Third, we have our very own Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Chapa. He is the Department of the Air Force's first Chief Responsible AI Ethics Officer and the DoD liaison to the Special Competitive Studies Project. Lieutenant Colonel Chapa holds a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford. His areas of expertise include just war theory, military ethics, especially the ethics of remote weapons and the ethics of artificial intelligence. He's a senior pilot with more than 1,400 pilot and instructor pilot hours. Our 4th panelist, Dr. Peter Norvig, is a Distinguished Education Fellow at Stanford's Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute and a researcher at Google, Inc. Previously, he directed Google's Core Search Algorithms Group and Google's Research Group. He was head of NASA's Ames Computational Sciences Division, where he was NASA's senior computer scientist and a recipient of NASA's Exceptional Achievement Award in 2001. He has taught at the University of Southern California, Stanford University, and the University of California at Berkeley, from which he received a PhD in 1986 and the Distinguished Alumni Award in 2006. He was a co-teacher of an artificial intelligence class that signed up 160,000 students, helping to kick off the current round of massive open online classes. Dr. Norvig's publications include the books Data Science and Context, Artificial Intelligence, A
know if you
Modern
wanted to be in
Approach.
it or not. It's a Air Force.
We've got a hot mic. Dr. Norvig's publications includes the books Data Science and Context, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, the leading textbook in the field, Paradigms of AI Programming, Case Studies in Common Lisp, Verb Mobile, a translation system for face-to-face dialogue, and Intelligent Help Systems for Unix. He is also the author of the Gettysburg PowerPoint presentation and the world's longest palindromic sentence. Dr. Norvig is a fellow of the AAAI, ACM, California Academy of Science, and American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Lastly, we have panelist Dr. Abby Fanlo. Dr. Fanlo is the policy and strategy lead on the Responsible AI team in the DoD's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office. Dr. Fanlo joined the Chief Digital and AI Office after working on Meta's product policy team, identifying the potential political, societal, and human risks associated with Meta's AI systems and developing solutions to address them. She also has a decade of experience in international security research with expertise in asymmetric alliances, extended deterrence, nuclear crises, and civil war. Dr. Fanlo has consulted for the U.S. intelligence community, Fortune 500 companies, and leading technology policy nonprofits on international security, international AI governance, and human rights issues. She holds a PhD, MA, and BA in political science from Stanford University. We are so very excited to hear from each of our panelists today. Mr. Suder, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley, for that introduction. And I want to welcome all the attendees, but special thanks to Ty Daniels and the United States Air Force team, the CDAO Strategic Communication team. They've been first class throughout this entire process. Before we dive into the discussion, just a little bit about ATARC. We're the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. We facilitate collaboration between government, industry, and academia, just like what we're doing today. We've got the website. You can just Google us, and we've got an event going probably every other day. So if you want to find out more about AI with our working groups and everything else, I want to dive right into the discussion. We're going to have each of the panels kind of give their opening comments on this topic. As Ashley said, we're going to be taking questions from you all. I've got some questions planned, but let's just make this more of a discussion. But maybe we could start off with you, Abby. I'd love to hear the latest and greatest at the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, how you are approaching this topic of responsible AI in the DoD.
Yeah, happy to start off. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As the intro or bio said, I work on the Responsible AI team at the CDAO, and our role is really to build tools and processes that enable DoD personnel who are working throughout the AI lifecycle to assess whether AI systems are aligned with the DoD's AI ethical principles. And that involves everything from actual technical capability development and advancing our technical maturity in the responsible AI space to workforce development and training to make sure that DoD personnel really understand the socio-technical risks associated with AI systems, to organizational and governance structure change and cultural change across the department that's going to enable the integration of a lot of the capabilities that we're building at CDAO. And all of that work stems from the DoD's AI ethical principles, which were adopted in 2020, and we were the world's first military to adopt AI ethical principles. And I think we're going to talk about the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights in this discussion. And when we get there, I'm happy to talk about kind of the alignment between the DoD's AI ethical principles and the blueprint, because I think there are a lot of synergies there. But from those ethical principles, we got together as a department as stipulated by the Deputy Secretary and the Responsible AI Working Council, which was comprised of representatives from many DoD components, took those principles and developed a 64-point strategy called the Responsible AI Strategy and Implementation Pathway, which puts those principles into actual practice throughout the AI lifecycle and through those different areas of work that I mentioned. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is overseeing the implementation of that strategy and building out specific deliverables like our Responsible AI Toolkit that we launched last year that are, again, going to enable DoD personnel to assess whether their systems align with the AI ethical principles and to mitigate any issues that arise from that assessment. So I'll stop there and look forward to sharing more throughout the discussion.
Yeah, just a real quick follow-up. Describe a little more about the toolkit and what the purpose of it is. That'd be great.
Yeah, so the Responsible AI Toolkit was one of the lines of effort that it was outlined in the Responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway. And what it comprises, or what comprises the toolkit, is planning and assessment tools that are a series of questions that allow personnel at various stages of the AI lifecycle to investigate and assess whether their system are aligned with our 5 AI ethical principles and aligned with responsible AI best practices. But then if they identify issues that indicate they're not, it also directs them to tools and resources to actually start to mitigate some of those issues. So the toolkit itself is both the assessment framework and the tools and resources that we think enable that assessment and enable risk mitigation or mitigation of any problems that arise. And there are various design features that we've built into the toolkit, but I'll mention a few that I think are important. The first is that we wanted this toolkit to enable documentation and traceability for DoD personnel. We wanted them to be able to use whatever they get out of filling out that toolkit, the artifacts, to actually demonstrate alignment with the AI ethical principles for the purposes of approvals internally, for policy review boards, like, for example, 3000.09 requires demonstrating alignment with the DoD AI ethical principles as part of that review process. So we want it to enable that kind of traceability and documentation. So it's designed to do that. It's also designed to be very modular and tailorable to different use cases and contexts, because, you know, there's a very wide variety of use cases for AI at DoD, from, you know, back office things like hiring to healthcare to weapon systems to logistics. And so we wanted it to be very tailorable to different domains. And then it also has a lot of features that enable kind of filtering to different roles on an AI team or an AI project team. So it's intended to help, if you're a program manager, figure out who do you need to go to in your organization to answer the different questions that are part of the assessment. So you can actually filter to work roles to figure out who you really need to talk to or who needs to own different parts of the assessment process. So those are a few of the features that we think make it useful. But one of the kind of big priorities for our team this year is actually going around and working with teams across DoD to validate the toolkit and get feedback on it and update it to make sure it's actually working for the teams across DoD that it's intended for. So it's definitely an MVP, and it's a living document that will be updated as we go forward. And we're really excited about the partnerships that we're developing right now, but also very open to more partnerships from across the department to get feedback.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Next, we got the home field advantage. We're going to go to the Air Force, and we'll go with you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks for pulling together the panel and for hosting. And it's always great to be on Innovation Connect. So I want to step back from policy for a little bit. Abby talked a lot about kind of the policy level. And for us as a military department, sort of nested under the DoD, we inherit the policies that come down from DoD. As she mentioned, we help to inform those policies, right? So we participated in the working group that produced the strategy and implementation pathway. But then when we inherit those policies from DoD, our job then is to implement them at the department, military department or service level. But I want to talk a little bit about the technology first before I circle back to the policy. So in my view, if you look at the history of all of those sort of major decision points that Abby mentioned, right? The adoption of the AI ethical principles, the stand-up of the JAIC and its responsible AI team that became the Chief Digital and AI Office, the responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway, all of those, you can kind of tell when you look closely at those artifacts that they're responding to what you could call the machine learning revolution that I'm gonna say started somewhere around 2012, right? So AlexNet wins the ImageNet competition using a deep neural network. That was the first time that people saw kind of the capabilities of deep neural networks using modern compute and especially graphic processor units. So this shift toward machine learning, in my view, as a sort of watcher of AI ethics, that's the catalyst that creates this field of AI ethics. So the people who have been doing AI for a long time are very quick and right to point out that AI has been around since forever, right? Coined in 1955, there were major AI developments in the 1980s and into the early 90s. But what changed in, again, roughly 2012, 2010, last 10 years or so, was this sort of heavy investment in deep neural networks. Now, here's the implication for ethics. Unlike the previous generations of AI with things like expert systems, instead of getting a deterministic system where one input will always result in the same output, deep neural networks give us more of a sort of stochastic means of getting from input to output, which means, first of all, I might not be able to predict what the output is from a deep neural network. And secondly, if the answer is wrong, if the network gives me the wrong answer, I might not be able to figure out exactly why it gave me that answer, right? So this is the black box AI problem that you hear about. So in my assessment, this whole field of AI ethics grew up in response to events that took place largely initially in industry and academia, where there were unintended outcomes, things like bias on the basis of race or bias on the basis of gender, where none of the developers intended to put that bias in there, but the bias was present in the historical data. They trained their neural network on that historical data, and so the end result ended up having unexpected ethical implications. All right, well, if you're the Department of Defense or the Department of the Air Force, you probably want to look at that and say, if industry use cases are producing unintended outcomes on issues such as, there are many others, but such as race and gender bias, what kinds of unintended consequences might I care about if I'm a military department, right? And so in addition to, of course, we care about things that are going on in finance and HR and medical systems, because we also have finance and HR and medical systems. But in addition to that, we have a warfighting function, right? My organization is designed to organize, train, and equip airmen and guardians to present those forces to combatant commanders. And when we conduct that mission, we have to kind of draw a through line that says, okay, if the challenges in unexpected, unanticipated outcomes in deep neural nets resulted in things like race and gender bias in industry, what does that look like in the combat environment? And so I think a lot of the work that Abby and the team at DoD have done exceptionally well is to produce both policy and strategy, but also things like the toolkit resources that are applicable both in the application to things like finance and medical and HR, but also equally applicable when we start talking about things like object classification in full motion video in the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance world, or course of action development using reinforcement learning to try to give commanders more options than they would be able to get out of a human planning staff. So our challenge is to take what we've learned, the excellent work that's been done in industry, draw that through line and say, what does that mean for us in the warfighting environment?
Yeah. What do you think your timelines are to declare some kind of success? I know we're really early. Do you have like some timelines for action inside the Air Force?
Well, we do. I'll talk about that in a second. But one way to think about this, right? It sort of just dawned on me. I'm sure the rest of you thought of this long before I did, but it just dawned on me several months ago as I was thinking about the great power competition and talking about a national defense strategy that says we're going to deter and, if necessary, defeat our adversaries. And if the question is, how do we measure success in deterring our adversaries? Well, if they haven't started a war, then we have successfully deterred them up until January 11th, 2024, right? So in a similar vein, how do we measure success against the responsible AI, this big, robust thing that we've built called responsible AI? Well, if we haven't created AI systems that have resulted in high impact failures, then I would say we're doing it successfully. Now, here's the challenge, I think. Over the last 10 years, as this machine learning technology has become more and more ubiquitous, right? In the early days, when we had things like Project Maven at the OSD level, there were a small number of sort of exquisite machine learning applications that were easy to keep our eyes on and manage. And as that technology proliferates across not just the Department of the Air Force but the DoD, it becomes much more difficult to sort of keep an eye on that whole set of things. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, at the policy level, what we're doing is trying to produce those guardrails that will successfully achieve our responsible AI goals across this massive, 600,000 person Department of the Air Force. So within the Department of the Air Force on the timelines, We have a stated goal that we want to be AI ready by 2025 that has a responsible AI line of effort. And a lot of that is meeting the demands of the that are required of us by Congress to provide an AI inventory through the DoD. And that allows us to see the AI applications that are being developed across the DAF. If we can't see what's out there, we can't evaluate it against the responsible AI guidance and the AI ethical principles. So that was by 2025, and we're currently building our roadmap beyond 2025. So I don't want to give away too much there. But our first aim there is AI ready by 2025. That's was initially prompted by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and that does include a responsible AI line of effort.
If you say something inadvertently, we'll keep it between us here with the hundreds of people on this webinar.
Appreciate it.
Okay, we'll try to do that. Tony, welcome again. And also, the National AI Institute, I regard as a very unique organization. Let us know a little bit about that in your intro. That'd be great.
Sure. So I'll go a little bit of me, a little bit of Nye, a little bit of where we're at. So just for the record and appreciation of the audience, I come at this from a very academical, deep level. I've been doing ethics for a long time. I taught ethics for a long time. For a long time, I was doing ethics as related to cognition, but I was worried about animals as the non-human intelligence as opposed to machines as the non-human intelligence. So I've been thinking about a lot of this for a while, and I found myself appreciative that VA has also found itself wanting to think about these things importantly. We are one of the first, not the first, but among the first agencies to stand up a framework like our associates at DoD have done, and to take it very seriously. And we try to do things with our framework that others may not have. I can also briefly suggest I worked at NASA for a little while and wrote the first draft of their policy, and theirs is also unique and interesting. I bring that up because I know that Joe mentioned that sometimes you run into AI experts that have done this for a long time, and they might be somewhat intransigent to new policy, new ethics. I certainly ran into that at NASA. The number of people that told me I've been doing AI longer than you've been alive is uncountable, and they were all very convinced that they were doing it well. So I think one thing that I just want to put early on, because I think there will be hesitance for some members of the audience about, why do we need to concern ourselves with this? We're all good, responsible, careful adults, is to sort of think about the idea of future-proofing and idiot-proofing as we go along, right? Just because you do well, and just because your peers do well, does not mean well will always be done. And I think that's part of why the VA has taken it so seriously is we don't have, similar to the DoD, but on the maybe other end of the coin, we don't have a lot of room for error when it comes to patient care and medical research, because to err is to probably kill someone, and that's not something we ever want to do. So we have taken a very firm stance about making sure that we get ethical and appropriate AI regulations up front. That we have included, for instance, we've included AI considerations in some of our IRBs, which is an internal institutional review board for medical research and similar research, and our ICUAC, which is the animal version, just to try to make sure that we take very seriously how AI is used in the medical context on a few levels, right? It doesn't just mean that we're not just talking about like machine surgery. We're also talking about how data privacy is done, and data management is done, to make sure that we process the data in an unbiased way, also to borrow from Joe. And I think that this is something that is hugely important. I mean, bioethics isn't new, right? A good friend of Joe Childress Jim Childress and Joe Bouchamp, and they're good folks and they've done a lot of work, but I know that their work doesn't always get well respected widely, particularly outside of academia. Bioethics is sort of like, why do you need that? Doctors are good people. The Hippocratic Oath exists. What are we concerned about? But I think there's a lot more to it, particularly as we start to engage technology. That's something that we as the VA take very seriously, and that's why we stood up the NIE in 2019 and tried to give it a pretty central role in steering policy and trying to place the NIE as a thought leader across government. NIE founded the Responsible AI Responsible AI Official Council, for instance, and other things to try to push that line. And I think part of why we might push the line past our agency sometimes is we're intimately aware that you folks right now on this call, who I take it from the chat are mostly military, you're gonna be our concern very soon. Right, so it is as much for you and in your interest that we do this as it is that the Department of Defense does this, and we are closely related. And I hope that as we go forward, there is as much or more coordination between DoD and VA to make sure that our responsible AI and understandings of appropriate AI use are consistent, because your data becomes our data, your people become our people, and there's nothing there to undersell or undervalue when it comes to coordination.
Fantastic. Next, we'll go with Tom Sasala. I know you were in the Navy. You had a lot of experience in the Navy, and semi-recently you came over to the Army. How are you all looking as a department into responsible AI?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I appreciate the ability to come here. And I will say that maybe perhaps my role is a little bit unique relative to the other folks that are here in the panel. But yeah, spending time as the Navy Chief Data Officer, and then prior to that, time as the Army Chief Data Officer, the appropriate use of data, generally speaking, was something that we've been worried about. I guess the good news is that Abby and the team up at the CDAO there really have taken some of the burden off of the military departments in terms of the heavy lifting in terms of policy. I will certainly say that the Army, not dissimilar to the Air Force, and the Department of the Navy as well, as a large organization. So my primary role here in terms of AI is not so much, thinking about the ethical use of AI, but it is really what I think Joe alluded to, which is really let's figure out where we are using AI, and then how do we apply a toolkit to a sense the department's position on many of this, and the different use cases. But Tony mentions, Joe mentioned this as well, right? Things that range on the business side, which is our predominant interest here in the Office of Enterprise Management, but all the way into the warfighting side, right? And what we're seeing is the ethical use of AI in warfighting has a tendency to take front and center for the DoD in terms of, is there going to be some autonomous something out there that is going to make a decision without a human in the loop, blah, 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 blah. But the larger, more sort of impactful thing is really on the business side, and the support functions and the generating force of the Department of the Army to that operational force. And so we are just in the early stages of trying to figure out where we are in the story. I was just talking to Mr. Garcia yesterday, who's the Army CIO, and really the CIO is responsible for inventorying IT. But we were discussing what he called the common operating picture of AI. Right? What is our site picture on where we are in a story? Do we have good metrics? Do we have good attributes in our portfolio management system saying that this system does use AI? And I don't have a tendency to like to use that term because there's not just one AI, right? And so is it using some form of advanced analytic, machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence type technique? And then what is it actually being used for, right? Because if it's something, I would say relatively innocuous of identifying patterns and trends from a fraud perspective, might have less of an impact to the Army's mission than if it's doing something on its own to take some action, right, or some response to some cyber incursion or something like this, right? So we're appreciative of all the work that everyone's done in this area in many regards, and then just having us take what I would say the incremental steps just to work towards the problem. And then really one of the other things, I just want to throw this out there, because between the CIO and the OEM, we have a component of this, but we have the Army's Futures Command, which is really responsible for looking over the horizon. And that's where a lot of the development, the deployment, the effective use of this technology is showing up in terms of our pipeline. And then even just this morning, there's Jen Swanson was out talking about some of the work that's going on in the data environment in ASAL, which is our acquisition executive, right? How do we filter that policy, that toolkit that Abby mentioned, and some of the things that Joe mentioned, into actionable policies in the acquisition community so that we can provide guidance to our mission partners and our defense industrial base, right? Because a lot of that innovation is also happening there. There's a lot of independent research being done in our defense contractor space, and they're proposing this to us as consumers of it, right? And then we have to make some decision. And I was about to say ethical decision, but some decision about, is this the right technology and is it going to do what we want it to do? And so I'm finding it a little bit overwhelming, the number of different facets we need to worry about simultaneously. So just, we're trying to decompose that down into relatively simple, I don't want to say sophomoric, but, relatively simple things that we can do to make incremental changes or, incremental progress towards the broader goals here.
Yeah, it seems challenging. There's so many domains you didn't think about. Like I hear software factories, they're going to incorporate all these GPTs.
Yeah.
How do you monitor that? How do you manage that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the things we were working with ASALT on. In fact, when Mr. Garcia actually became the CIO, he came from the Army G2, which is intelligence community, and they have their own concerns around some of this. But there was ChatGPT specifically was widely available. It was freely available on the Doden, and people were using it for a wide variety of mission-related things, right? Whether it's write this algorithm for me, or finish this paper for me, or things like that, right? And so we quickly learned that maybe the answers out of it were not well informed, or not, or maybe were. I don't want to say there was a bias there, but in some cases there was a bias, right? But we are also, inadvertently providing that information to the broader corpus. And so adversaries can turn around and do a similar query of, hey, what is the DoD doing in this area? And is getting answers based on our own questions, right? And so that is hugely problematic, as you can imagine. So, we've taken steps to kind of limit the use and provide guidance in some regard. And for simple things like, help me, build the next algorithm to, count averages or something, maybe it might be an appropriate use, right? But really having working with Army Futures Command and DevCom to say, do we bring something like Chat GPT in-house? I mean, this is something certainly we want to partner with CDAO as well as the Air Force and the Navy on, provide the capability internal, so that we have a corpus that is trained on a broad, hopefully, relatively speaking, unbiased data set, but it is also then turned around and amplified with our own corpus of information, right? And so that's super challenging to do. And I know that there's been folks at the Jake prior as well as CDAO now that are thinking about this, trying to noodling through some of these problems. And at least I can certainly say on my time on the Navy side, we were kind of waiting in the wings to leverage that capability. And so certainly I think the Army's doing the same.
Great, thank you. Next, let's go to Stanford. I don't know if you're out there, Dr. Norvig, but good to have you again. Peter?
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually at home 2 miles away from the Stanford campus, but close. So as Tony was mentioning, I'm an AI hipster. I was doing it before it was cool. I'm now at the Human-Centered AI group at Stanford, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what does that mean. And to me, it means to focus on the overall system and the impact that it has on all the people involved. And that's a little bit of a change for me, because before that, I was really kind of focused on the technology and the algorithms and the mathematical formulas and so on. And yeah, we still need those. But the important part is, what's the impact on people? So for example, you think about a self-driving car. If you do traditional software design, you say, who's the user? Well, it's the driver, so we want a good experience for them and a good user interface and so on. But if you do human-centered design, you say, yes, the driver's one of the people involved, and you want to have a good experience for them. But there's also the other drivers and the other pedestrians, and you have to do good by them. And there's also the effect on society of traffic and where do people live and commute patterns and so on. And all of those become part of the problem. So it really changes how we look at things. I definitely agree with Joe, who said the turning point was around 2010, 2012. For me, I remember the specific day in 2010 when I was sitting down for lunch and Jeff Hinton walks by with his laptop and says, I got to show you this. It finally works. And that became the ImageNet winning system, and was really the launch of this change. I think that the change to machine learning, I think, came in the late 80s and 90s, but the change to deep learning came right around then, and that was certainly a big thing. And I agree that it introduces a lot of problems with uncertainty and randomness and explainability and so on. But I think sometimes we get confused of where that comes from. And some of it comes from the solution, the fact that it's hard to interpret neural nets, but some of it just comes from the problem and the fact that we're addressing problems that are inherently more difficult. And we used to say, well, expert systems are easy to understand because they have rules that says if A and B is true, then do X. And that's true. That's easy to understand. But you look at that and you understand it and said, yes, I agree with that rule. And then that rule is wrong in one case. And you look at it again and you say, oh, yeah, well, of course, what I meant was if A and B, but not C. It goes without saying that it doesn't apply if C is true. Uh, and and so there's uncertainty and there's bugs in all these systems. And some of it just has to do with the difficulty of the problem. So let's not blame the messenger of the neural nets. So certainly 2023 was the year of large language models and to some extent image models. I expect 2024 to be the year of integration. And we've heard some of that already of saying, well, what's going to be important now is actually taking action. So yeah, making up a story and coming up with an answer, that's interesting, but taking the action is where it's really going to be important. And that means it's going to be much more of a responsibility for us to get that right. Because actions in the physical world, it's harder to press the undo button, unlike in the digital world. And I think we'll see a combination of traditional approaches along with these neural net approaches, and you see that in things like AlphaGo, where yes, the breakthrough that allowed it to be a Go champion sort of a decade before anybody thought that would happen is because of the large neural nets. But inside the system, there were also traditional game search algorithms, the Monte Carlo game search algorithms. So I think we'll see more of that kind of combinations. And similarly, we talked about this aspect of generating programs. And to me, it's really amazing that you can take a large language model and not tell it anything specifically about programming, and it's helpful. And sometimes it makes mistakes, and you can't just take it verbatim, but it's really helpful. I think we'll soon see a better integration. So yes, it works. You just throw text in. But the reason we built large language models is because we don't know the syntax and semantics of English, but we do know the syntax and semantics of Python and Java. So I think we'll see more integrations where we take advantage of that as well. So it's going to be an exciting time.
Yeah. Just as a follow-up, large language models, are there particularities with them on the responsible AI front that you've seen that are troublesome that we have to watch out for?
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues. I think the main one is anytime you build this system, you have to think of building a whole system and not just building a program. And I think the more the systems sort of seem like they're intelligence, the more we kind of back away from that responsibility. I call it the Chauncey Gardner effect from the movie Being There, where there was a guy who was not very smart, but he wore a really nice suit. So when he talked, everyone believed him. And I think the large language models are like that. The first thing we've had that can talk a really good game, and so we say, well, it must be right then. And so we have to guard against that. One of the best examples I've seen of a well-working system is I showed up at the airport once, and the terminal was mostly dark, and I said, uh-oh, this is going to be a big problem. And they had a power outage. There was some emergency backup, so some of the lights are on, but not all the lights were on, and all the computers were out. But I got on my plane and took off on time because someone had thought of saying, yeah, we've got this cool computerized system, but what if it's down? What are the backups? And there were paper backups, and it was a little unusual, but we took off. And if you're not thinking of what do I do when the system's down, you haven't built a safe and reliable system. And so, kudos for them for thinking ahead of time of that. And that's something that we all have to do.
Great. We actually have a question directed to Abby, but I think anybody else can chip in. And these philosophical questions that come in, this is a really good one. The question is I wonder if there's a relationship between deriving AI actions from data with lower data confidence. Is it ethical to use unhealthy data for certain mission tasks? I'm going to bomb the convoy. I've got really rough data. but you know what? I got the data. The AI says to target it. Abby, kind of like go over the thought process behind a scenario like that.
So, one of the DoD's AI ethical principles is a commitment to minimizing unintended bias in AI capabilities. And I think the word unintended there is really important because, AI models are going to have some type of bias, but it's about understanding where that bias is and making sure that you address bias that isn't appropriate or is unintended. And that mirrors and aligns with, in the blueprint, emphasis on pushing back against discrimination and building equitable AI systems. But to actually get there, and this is related to what the questioner was emphasizing, is that we really need to prioritize a DoD in which the data that's being used to train our AI models is accurate and representative really of the real world scenarios and populations that the models are going to affect. And that's going to be critical to aligning our systems with that principle, that equitable principle. And so to get there, we're doing a few things. We're establishing data governance policies and standards that promote data quality security across the DoD so that data that's used to train models really is representative of the scenarios and the people that the models are going to impact. We're also developing data literacy and awareness training programs so that DoD personnel actually really understand the potential sources, but also the impact of bias in the data that's used to train these AI models, and also the impact of the bias that is residual in those AI models. And so that in those kinds of scenarios, right, the personnel understand what decision they are making when they figure out what the right approach is. We're also creating validation and verification processes for the data to check, for errors, inconsistencies, and class imbalances before and after using that data for AI model development. So I think that gives, I guess, hopefully a perspective on how important we think quality data is and how important we think it is to develop models that are aligned with our commitment to minimizing unintended bias in AI capabilities. And we actually launched a bias bounty program at DoD last summer that is an ongoing effort, and we're trying to take the bias bounty program that has been successful in industry, that was used in the context of industry, but also to apply the blueprint this past summer at DEF CON, and bring that into the DoD context so that we can start building that kind of muscle memory around identifying bias in AI models, so that so that we can build systems that are aligned with that equitable principle. In terms of the specific scenario, I think Lieutenant Colonel Chapa probably has maybe more to say in the specifics, but I think that is how we're thinking about it at the CDAO level, and that's how important we feel that quality data is for meeting our commitment to an equitable AI system across DoD.
No problem. Colonel Chapa, you want to chip in?
Sure, ever so briefly. I'm looking around the room for a soapbox for this next part. So I think it's everything that Dr. Fanlo says is right. I completely agree. But specifically when we talk about the combat environment in which commanders, decision makers have imperfect information, which is 100% of the time in the combat environment, I think the workforce development challenge facing us to make sure that commanders faced with those outputs from AI tools understand enough about how the system is operating to be able to make wise choices about how to understand those outputs, right? So for instance, if you have let's say it's an object classification computer vision tool that was trained on a desert environment. I know this is a really rudimentary example, but just hear me out, right? And then you want to go use that in a different combatant command that has a different environment. The commander does not have to be a comp sci PhD, but the commander has to know that changing the operational data is going to affect system performance, right? And so I'm okay with the idea that we would use a model that was trained on limited training data because that's the only training data we could get on the adversary. I'm okay with that, so long as our commanders are sophisticated enough users to be able to interpret that output for what it is, which is a pretty low PK, right? Pretty low probability of success. So to me, the thing that keeps me up at night, right? I would hate for us to get to a point where a commander makes a bad decision and we all kind of look around and go, well, what could we have done? We had limited data. Well, the thing we could have done was, rewind back to 2024 and upskill that commander so that they're prepared to make wise decisions based on those inputs down the road. Thanks.
Go ahead, Peter.
I would agree with that, but I think we also have to upscale our systems, right? So yes, we want our users to be sophisticated enough to understand what the capabilities are, but we don't want the system to say, "Here's my decision." We want it to say, here's my best guess, and here's why there's uncertainty, and here's the things you should consider in taking my recommendations into account.
Yeah, I can think of a patient, it gives you a range of outcomes. It probably shouldn't say you have cancer, right? It won't say that. Hey, we need to operate immediately.
Right.
Anybody else want to chip in?
Yeah. So I think Joe. So I was hoping to jump in after Abby, but Joe got most of what I was hoping to emphasize. But I really want to like push it super hard. Education is absolutely necessary. Education is, I mean, you can have the most perfect policy and the most faultlessly engineered AI, and if the end user doesn't know how to use it or how to interpret it, misuse will happen, inefficiencies will happen, risk will increase. This is a big reason why one of the main things NI has done, and we actually do it with Air Force and Navy, who are both our partners on, or is it there it is, Aspire. Our program is that notion of like we need to figure out what the baseline knowledge is, and we need to repair any gaps in knowledge quickly, because that's where the risk is. To borrow from Peter's earlier comment about, the gentleman with the fine suit will disparage you, or sorry, will deceive you. Like AI is not going to show up in a suit. AI is not going to show up in anything that's going to give you any outward impression that it is or is not more or less capable than any other AI you've seen or any other output you've seen from a computer. So it's going to be absolutely necessary to make sure that users know, as Joe mentioned, what an AI can and cannot do, what it is and is not trained to do, when they can and cannot use it. But like you mentioned briefly there, the medical case, I mean, that's definitely the case. And to not like push on the question asker, but even in the question, there's that almost a hint behind it of the like, well, I'm just going to rely on the AI. So what am I going to do if the AI's information is bad? Like even that sort of unspoken assumption is a problem right off, right? The AI should not be right now or at any point in the future the objective decision maker. At best, AI should be a thing that gives you a piece of information that you take with a grain of salt, upon which you then make a better and further, more informed decision.
Yeah, hey Tom, I think that's a great point that Tony brought up there, and I was just sitting here thinking, when Intel started putting the Intel sticker insides on laptops, I mean, do we need an AI inside sticker is a visual cue to commanders or decision makers that this is informative, but it is not absolute, right? I don't know what the right answer is. I certainly having an inventory, knowing where you're, I'm going to again air quote AI because that's a lots of different things, but knowing where it is and how it contributes to the mission, I think is going to be important. But just simply having ethical boundaries doesn't matter if you don't know that it's assisting you inadvertently or overtly, right?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I'm on, just in the consumer side. I don't know if I'm with a person from another country or it's AI. The AI told me to do it, right? I think you all are bringing up great points. Abby, I'd like to go back to you alluded to it in your opening comments, but the AI Bill of Rights framework specifically addresses how does the AI Bill of Rights framework specifically address the unique challenges and needs within the Department of Defense, and then I'd like everybody else to kind of talk about what it does and some other things we need to be aware of.
Yeah, so we in the RAI division at CDAO, we're lucky to have the opportunity to help contribute to the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights through our interagency process and through the AI equity IPCs run by the White House. And so along with a lot of other interagency stakeholders, we got the opportunity to weigh in and provide equities from the DoD side. But I think we feel really strongly that the blueprint complements the DoD's AI ethical principles, and there's really nice synergy and alignment. So for example, 3 of the DoD's AI ethical principles are responsible, reliable, and governable. And responsible is really about, a lot of what we were just talking about, but making sure that DoD personnel have the capability, the training, the resources to exercise AI capabilities. The reliable principle is really about making sure that our systems have robustness to perturbations in the data, and that we're doing classic test and evaluation work in AI and adapting that to the AI context. And the governable principle is really about making sure that The department has the ability to detect unintended consequences arising from the use and deployment of AI capabilities, and to disengage or deactivate systems as necessary or as they decide based on the potential for that unintended behavior. And those three principles, those 3 out of 5 of our principles align very closely with the safe and effective systems principle in the blueprint and the sort of human alternatives, consideration, and fallback principle. As I mentioned, another one of our principles is equitable, which really nicely aligns with the principle around pushing back against discrimination and building equitable AI systems. And then our 5th principle is traceability, which is about making sure that we have the right documentation in place to understand where the data comes from that was used to train a model, the decisions around model weights and parameters that were made, and the evaluation metrics that were applied to an AI model, the risk assessments and mitigations that were put in place, so that down the line, when things go well, we can go back and identify best practices, but also when things go wrong, we can go back and hold folks accountable and make sure that we, in the future don't make the same mistakes. And I think that aligns with the notice and explanation piece, because only when you have that kind of documentation are you going to be able to help end users and warfighters understand how the technology works and how it was trained and developed. So we see a lot of natural, I think, alignment between the two things and a lot of complementarity.
Fantastic. Joe, you want to comment about it, how you're fitting in the AI Bill of Rights framework into what you're doing at the Air Force?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with what Abby said about the sort of the big picture view of the Bill of Rights. Keep in mind, this was designed for the entire U.S. government, right? So incredibly broad brushstrokes. And as I mentioned, there are specific things about the DoD or the Department of the Air Force that don't get a lot of attention in this document, as you might expect. And one thing I do think is noteworthy about the progression of policy and guidance that's been coming out of the federal government is that when this was published, it's very clear in the sort of preamble that this is optional. These are sort of to be considered as best practices. And then I guess it's been roughly about a year, right? About a year later, we get the executive order that came out this last fall, which has considerably more teeth, right? It's directing agencies to adopt certain practices. And again, DoD is special, right? Defense is special. And so that executive order says there's going to be a forthcoming OMB memo, which we've seen drafts of, and a national security memo, right? So we're going from very large, very big picture, and then eventually getting down to specific guidance for the DoD. And I do think that's where the rubber meets the road, because the Bill of Rights, which is great, and we were able to comment on it as it was going through its maturity process also. But you can tell the way it's written, it almost envisions customers, right? It's a customer service approach, saying if you are a U.S. citizen that's going to be or a U.S. person that's going to be a customer of some government agency, here's what you should expect from us, right? And while I think that's very important, within the DoD we just have a different set of responsibilities. So first of all, our members have given up some of their rights while they're in uniform. I think we can all agree on that, right? And yet we still owe them due diligence on things like data privacy, et cetera. If you will give me the chance for one quick war story. It's not really a war story at all, but the principle of human alternatives, consideration, and fallback is really interesting to me, because in the DoD context, we're not always going to have that option. But I was a very proud American. Recently, I was getting on an airplane, and I can't remember who the airline was, but they wanted to use biometric data. They want to use facial recognition rather than have the agent scan my boarding pass. And I opted out. It was an international flight, and I opted out because I don't know what the carrier is going to do with my biometric data, so I didn't want them to have it. And so then the guy behind me tried to opt out, and the agent said, "Are you a U.S. citizen?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Oh, well, you can't opt out." Right. So the fact that the U.S. government has created rules with air carriers to protect me from having a company forcibly obtain my biometric data, that's actually very important to me as a citizen. I'm proud of that, right? Now, in the DoD context, things are going to be slightly different, right? And I'm thinking especially when we talk about things like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the combat environment, we are not as concerned about privacy in that information gathering environment as we are domestically with U.S. citizens and U.S. persons. So the blueprint is great, but it definitely stops short of providing guidance that applies in the combat environment. And like I said, you're seeing the sort of subsequent dominoes start to fall to get us toward comprehensive guidance in the defense and intelligence community realms.
While we're on the subject of the Bill of Rights, what are the hard things? What are the hard things in the Bill of Rights that are going to be hard for us as a government to implement?
Well, I think like so as some of you may know, like ATARC is part of this event. ATARC my work group with ATARC did a series of panels on this, and we wrote a white paper on it. And there was a lot of things that were suggested as, could be hard, could be questionable, needs definition. But I think just as an easy answer, maybe even an unsatisfactorily easy answer, like notice and transparency is something that we immediately identified as logistically improbable, to the point that I think our expert, who's actually a security expert from the Naval Postgraduate School, Dr. Britta Hale, I think she asserted actually be mathematically impossible to give everybody the necessary notice required to do the things that the Bill of Rights expect us to do. So, I mean, certainly we shouldn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Notice is important, transparency is important, but we're gonna have to think very hard about how we do that in a way that is practicable, because a non-enforceable requirement might as well not be a requirement. If it is undoable, it cannot be a must. That's an ethical and logical violation to mandate an impossible thing. So we should think very hard when we look at the Bill of Rights. And it is a blueprint, right, for the record. Can't keep yourself dry with a blueprint, right? You don't pay property tax in a blueprint. A blueprint is not a thing. But as we try to make the blueprint an actual something we should take a very close mind to is it practically enforceable? If not, what can we change to keep the idea but make the inaction more reasonable?
Great. I was going to go to you, Peter. I'm just kind of interested in Silicon Valley, the academic community. What are you looking at something like the AI Bill of Rights put out by the U.S. government? Is that some kind of a guideline? Do you have your own guidelines? What's your take on that? You got you on mute?
Sorry, everybody has guidelines now. The U.S. one was one of them. I have one through Stanford University. I have another one through Google. There's ones through the professional societies like the ACM and so on. I joined a AI safety group with Underwriters Laboratory. And I thought that was interesting because the last time there was a technology that the public thought was going to kill everybody, it was electricity. And there were laws and legislation and so on, but there was also this Underwriters Laboratory is a non-governmental, third-party, nonprofit organization, and they said we'll put a sticker on your toaster that says it's probably not going to kill you, and consumers like that, and therefore companies went along with it. So I think there'll be a range. It'll come from all these places. There'll be constraints. I agree with Tony that the notice and explanation seem like the most difficult thing to deal with. Data privacy is also difficult. And then I guess the other aspect is, as you're saying, it is a blueprint and it's not complete. And we're going to need to complete that. So yeah, it's easy to say users should have privacy, but it's hard to say, okay, I've got a database of faces. Exactly what am I allowed to do with it and what am I not allowed to do with it? So I think we're going to need a level down, and some of that will be through principles, some of that will be through legislation. Some of it I think might be through case law, right? So in our judicial system, we have laws, but we also have case law that says this law is ambiguous, but here's a precedent that says here's the kinds of things you're expected to do and the kinds of things you're not expected to do. So I think all of those will combine together, and over time we'll start getting a better feeling for what you can do.
Well, we have about 15 at least questions or comments. One of the comments is thoughts on a scoring AI-based knowledge graph analysis or digital twin comparison. How do we score this and measure it? Because it seems like it's going to be rather difficult. And maybe I'll start off with you, Abby. How do we measure responsible AI, and can we score it? Can we come up with this UL idea where things are certified? What are some of the thoughts that you've heard around the DoD regarding this?
Yeah, so I think something that's really important to emphasize with responsible AI is like something is not responsible or irresponsible. there is a spectrum of things that we want to evaluate folks on, or sorry, things that we want to evaluate an AI system on. And you're not going to end up with a yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down answer. And I do spend a lot of time trying to explain that to people. But that being said, obviously you want to develop ways to encourage commanders, to encourage senior leaders, organizational leaders to look at the artifacts from something like a risk assessment and then make a determination of whether or not they're comfortable with the results. And in the RAI toolkit, in our Defense AI Guide on Risk, we talk a little bit about how to think about levels of acceptable risk in different contexts. And so I think that's one way that we're trying to get at this is encouraging leaders and commanders to think about the types of risk and the levels of risk they'd be comfortable with, and not imposing a threshold from the CDAO level on all different kinds of metrics about what we think is appropriate, because it's going to be dependent. And I think this speaks to like a broader challenge with AI policy and responsible AI work, and that's that the field is evolving really rapidly. There's tons of different kinds of use cases at DoD, and as Joe has mentioned a lot, the warfighting context is really different than like an enterprise context. And so we need to make sure not only that the policies and processes that we build are flexible enough to be adapted quickly as the field evolves, but also flexible enough to be adapted to different use cases so that it's not unreasonable for us to be disseminating them across DoD and asking people to use the processes we're building because they feel like they're so divorced from their use case or they're not flexible for their use case. So we think a lot about that. And then the other point I'd make is that one of the reasons I think something like the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights or the DoD AI ethical principles is like a really good starting point for AI and responsible AI policy is because it's based on principles that aren't going to change as the technology changes. And it's not based on identifying a specific threshold, but it's about taking democratic values and our values as a military and putting them into the context of the AI space. And those principles aren't going to change as the technology evolves. They're not going to tell you that something is or isn't responsible, but they're going to help provide a framework for building out the right kinds of evaluations and the right kinds of metrics that we want to undertake to make sure that our systems are aligned with those values. So hopefully that sort of answers the question to some extent, and excited to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, maybe we can go to Tony, not to be too self-serving since you chair our working group, but what are some of the solutions you think are possible based on the discussions you've had in the group?
Solutions for, just to make sure I don't under over answer, solutions for what aspect of this specifically?
Well, solutions for
quantifying responsible AI.
Like how can we make sure we have guidelines that are measurable, that I don't go off the rails. I'm designing a system. How do I follow guidelines that are possible, that I keeping off the rails? Can we automate that to some degree?
Yeah. So I think we can. Yeah, I think we can, but not directly. I think this is going to be one of those cases where we need to look at the pieces that make up the whole and then figure out which some of those are operable. So for instance, things about security and privacy, some amount of bias, some amount of safety, arguably purpose. You can capture some of these things in something that might not be branded responsible AI, but there are extant privacy protocols, there are extant security protocols. Software bill of materials and the domesticity requirements that fall under software bill of materials should be taken very seriously, particularly for AI systems that are deployed in a defense and or healthcare context. And those things are automated. Aspire has an SBOM that is automated. We've met with people when we picked which one we want. We picked one, right? There are already companies and universities out there that have automated SBOM procedures that can cover some of those things. Efficacy is obviously very measurable, right? That's just the same as you would measure efficacy in any other context, right? Because it's a success-based term, efficacy is. So you're looking at results, and the results are unmasked. There's no mystery once you're looking at the actual impact of the effect. I do think, though, one thing that is going to be pretty hard to measure, if only because we've never measured it, is probably fairness. And when I say never measured it, I'm talking as a philosopher for a moment, which I think maybe Joe will appreciate, right? Everything was philosophy at some point, and then kids moved out of the philosophy house, right? Math left pretty early, and then psychology left last. They only left in the early 1900s. People don't think about it, but that was philosophy quite recently. right? So there is, and fairness is still justice and fairness and Rawlsian concepts, and if they're relevant and what's applicable and what happens when fairness as a notion meets ground and meets law is still a question that philosophy is dealing with, which means it's still a question society hasn't decided is resolved enough to change it to a different practice, right? Once philosophy decides something, you guys take it from us. You're like, oh, math makes sense now, it's ours. Psychology makes sense now, it's ours. Justice and fairness is still in philosophy's house, which means it's something that we don't have definitions for, don't have an answer for, don't have an objective sense of. And given that, definitionally, I don't think it'd be possible to measure. You could measure fair impact. You could see if the outcrop, if the results are fair. You could check the data to see if the data collection practices are fair. But I don't know if the question of can you measure the fairness of an AI's process is even a sensical question to ask in the first place. Like I don't even know if that's something we could ever possibly fix, frankly. But I've only been on the planet for like a third of a century. I'm sure maybe others might have more wisdom on that.
Great. My next question, I just keep cybersecurity and how it's evolved. I think of AI a little bit. How can policy ensure responsible AI practices while not hindering innovation? Tom, I'm kind of going to go to you. I know you have done a lot in cyber. How do I not let this hinder innovation? I'm so worried about responsible AI. I'm not getting what I need to get done, right? How do we do that? What lessons have we learned from the past?
Well, I don't know that I know the answer to that direct question.
Give you a hard one. Sorry.
It certainly is, and I was actually, when you were reading the question, I was kind of thinking to myself, I hope he doesn't call on me, but I'm just kidding. So I was just thinking a little bit about what Tony just said, and this concept of fairness is subjective, right? And I think the concept of innovation and hindering innovation might also be subjective, right? And so we in the DoD have a tendency for some of our platforms to take a long time to qualify them for operational use, right? For a variety of different reasons. Safety of life being predominantly the largest one. Sometimes it's a reliability or a survivability issue, right? So the application of artificial intelligence, I am really stymied mentally around how do we qualify that as done enough, right? Baked or whatever. And is it adding that there were some comments in the chat here also about the kind of trust or over distrust, right? Which I thought was interesting. Is it innovative enough, whatever that means, right? And it's contextual, right? So I do think to a certain extent, fear of the unknown is going to hold everything back for some period of time. And I don't know that it's a question of trust versus not trust or distrust versus trust. I like everything. There was a day when computers would never launch a nuclear weapon, right? And they don't do so without a human in the loop. Don't get me wrong. There's, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have a whopper laying around somewhere that's doing some magic. But there's still a lot more technology in the DoD than anyone probably would have wanted 50 years ago, right? So I think it's a matter of time. As things become more commoditized, as they become more ubiquitous, as the people that grow up with these things inherently and tacitly trust them, they will become more pervasive, right? This is true, I think, for just about anything. And I said this about data, generally speaking. In 20 years, I won't have to have a data acumen program, right? Because people will just be upskilled in data. It's going to be a given. We don't have that luxury right now. We have to upskill our workforce in a variety of different areas, right? I think AI, machine learning, the understanding the boundaries of neural networks and large language models and whatnot will be a de facto standard for anyone coming out of high school in 10 or 15 years, right? Certainly, as a proud father of a 20-year-old in college, the use of AI to answer certain questions is not unknown. Is not unknown territory. The ethics of it, are questionable. So that's, I mean, your original question, going back to the original question, is very challenging to wrap your kind of head around and wrap my head around. I don't know that I have like I said, a clear answer. But just think of this as evolutionary rather than revolutionary in terms of its application over time. I'll that, I'll turn it back to you.
I'm going to go. I'm going to hopefully warmed up Abby. I think that I remember for cyber, it's best to incorporate it from the beginning, right? It's best to incorporate. I got a new system or I have an existing system. What would you recommend to somebody they're designing a new system incorporating AI right now?
Well, can I answer the question that you just asked, Tom? Because I haven't.
Okay, I forgot what it was.
Sorry,
so
I have.
yeah.
Okay, great, perfect. I have a really strong desire to answer this question because I think I totally get the premise of it, right? Which is like this idea that AI policy or responsible AI structures are going to come in and they're going to create all these compliance requirements, and we're not going to be able to innovate and compete with our near peer adversaries, and that's our goal at the DoD. But I think we need to kind of rethink about what AI policy and what responsible AI processes and tools and capabilities offer. So when you think about being a developer or an innovator who's building an AI capability, there's a cognitive load associated with thinking about how do you build a system that the end user is going to trust, and especially that the warfighter is going to trust to operate as promised, that the warfighter is going to trust to not introduce moral and legal consequences for them when they use it. And there's a cognitive load associated with how do I build a safe and reliable system. So when you actually provide people, developers and innovators, the tools and the capabilities and the processes to do that, and you show them, here's what you need to do, that reduces the cognitive load associated with all of that work, and they can focus on the innovation piece. And there's a common saying in the safety literature that brakes make trains go faster. And I think that that's sort of how we can think about the responsible AI work, which is that when you know what you need to do to put those brakes in place or to consider what is necessary to ensure the system is going to operate as promised and is going to be trusted and reliable for the end user, you can go more quickly on the innovation side. And then if you do that, the capability that you're putting in the hands of our end users, which may be warfighters, they may be people that are supporting warfighters in a variety of functions across the DoD, if they trust those capabilities to operate as promised, to not introduce moral and legal consequences if they use them, they're going to be a lot more likely to actually use that technology and adopt it in the ways that we want them to do that. And that's going to require a lot of education about all of the work that we're doing to make sure those systems are responsible, as we've talked about. But I think that actually, if we think about it that way, we can understand that responsible AI can really enable innovation and adoption. And that's the kind of conversation that we should be having. And we should be really focused on making sure that whatever processes and policies we put in place actually do that.
So, Joe, I have to ask you, in the Air Force, do brakes make planes go faster?
Air brakes
I'd love
do.
to hear your comments. That's a good one, though. I'm gonna steal that one from you, Abby. That was a good one. Joe, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I'll go back to a little bit of what Tony said. I've never heard it stated quite so boldly that when a question becomes settled, you all take it from us. But I like it, and I'm stealing it. And so everything Tony says about fairness is right. But I do think we can take one step away from that abstraction and get a little more concrete if we recognize that AI is not imposing the question of fairness on us, right? The question of fairness is already imposed on us because we have a system that deals with people. And so we're faced with that challenge. And within that system, we do have sort of, demarcated, codified rules that try to execute fairness well. We could debate all day about how we can make those better, but those already exist, right? And so in the AI world, we don't have to solve the fairness problem, the fairness philosophical problem, in order to get AI tools that do well. All we need to do, I think, is develop AI tools that conform to the codified rules that we've already agreed on, right? So I don't have the numbers memorized, but I once pulled the racial demographic data of the Air Force Officer Corps, and it looks exactly like what you would expect, right? It's more diverse at the junior levels, people who came in more recently, and it becomes much, much less diverse as you get toward the 4-star general level. If I were to just take that raw historical promotion data and train a prediction model against it, I bet you it would have racial implications, right? We've already decided as an institution that we don't want that. And so then the challenge is, okay, how do I build an AI system that acknowledges that submits to the rules that we've already put in place, right? So I do think there's some practical sort of tactical level things we could do to resolve some of those issues without recognizing that the philosophical problems are still pretty hard to solve.
Great. Dr. Norvig, you have anything to add? You're on mute.
I guess to answer again, everybody wants to answer this question about innovation. I think the amount of responsible practices you have is proportional to the amount of impact you have. So if you're doing a research project that isn't going to touch anybody, then you can have more innovation. And when you start deploying it, then you have to be careful. Now, there's always a trade-off of it's always good to start first and not tack on responsibility afterwards. So if you want to have a successful result, you should think about that from the start. But I think you can manage research in such a way that it's not constrained by this and in fact is informed and helped by this idea of being responsible.
Yeah, I guess it depends on your use case, right? If
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good. I think that's a really good point.
And Tom, if you don't mind my jumping in, there's a
Yeah,
workforce development nugget to pull out of there also, right? Which is that the workforce will employ AI tools more safely if they get more reps and sets in, right? If they have the ability to use AI tools more often, and the place to do that is in the low risk use cases, right? So if I could give every airman access to a generative AI capability at various levels of classification today, just to help them make PowerPoint slides or whatever, I would snap my fingers and do it, because by using the tool on a relatively low consequence use case, they will become better at building that calibrated trust down the line when they want to use the tools for higher consequence use cases. So get the reps and sets. I think that's the best thing we can do for the workforce.
I think that's fantastic. Anybody else want to add? I think workforce huge, big part of the CDAO. Anybody else want to talk about what some of the things we can work with the workforce now?
For starters, I want to foot stomp what Joe said in a big way. Need practice. You need practice in a low risk environment. It's one of the things we're trying to fix in Aspire with the VA and with the DoD is trying to figure out a way to do some training for risk environments, particularly in the VA, right? Like we can't have people practicing AI surgical tools on real people. And our Navy partners often remind me we can't practice submarine repair tools on a real submarine because destroying a submarine bad, destroying a human life bad, right? So there's an opportunity to use technology for like AR, VR, and situations like that to give people a low risk simulated version, which I think will be very good. I also think one thing that we do in Aspire that's important for education, this is more like getting back to the practical things you can actually do that are actually going to work in real world. One of the big pushbacks we get on education a lot, and this also goes back to what I mentioned in NASA, where everybody just told me they've been doing this wrong and I've been alive, and I said, shut up, is this idea that nobody really wants to take a big, old, learn everything about AI sort of class. Nobody wants to sit and do 20 hours of education. The government should not pay for 20 hours of labor times however the heck many people we have in dollars, particularly when a lot of that education is not going to be necessary, because to go back to Tom's point, right, there's a lot of people, particularly as we're getting younger and younger, who have a lot of extant data literacy and have some AI familiarity. And you have people that have their PhD in data science that, Joe called out earlier. And you have people that taught themselves coding in their basement and all those other things. So I think one thing to take very seriously when we talk about workforce upskilling is the idea of starting with some sort of baselining to get a sense of where somebody is before you start trying to teach them to where they need to go. If for no other reason than the efficiency and the enjoyment, where they're going to be much more happy if they only have to learn what they need to learn. We're going to be much better as a government only spending money training people on what they actually need to train. So for whatever it might be worth, I'm not saying I have the magic sauce for exactly what to teach people or exactly what people need to know, but when we settle what that end goal is, what that ground truth to which we need to get workforce readiness, then I think an important step is then to baseline and to customize and personalize education along the way to make sure that, because that's also going to get us there, frankly, one last thing that's going to get us there faster, right? I maintain a big thing that when I started Aspire, my first assertion was anybody who doesn't know enough AI and is trying to use AI presents risk and is not ready. And to mitigate that risk, you must get them to readiness. The most efficient way to do that is to personalize and to be specific and to not just try to force all X million of us in the government through some introduction to AI class that takes 2 weeks. It's just not going to work.
Yeah,
Yes.
Tom, I'd just like to add on that too, because when Eileen and I, Eileen Virginia's Air Force CDO or CDAO, we were talking about the kind of the workforce acumen problem set. That is what Tony said is just spot on. It's one of the things that we immediately gravitated towards, which is the stratification of skill sets, right? And you don't need to put, someone who has significant expertise in data management in a data management 101 class. It's a waste of everyone's time. The one size fits all sort of approach, which quite honestly the government in general and DoD specifically is sort of famous for, just simply doesn't work with a lot of these advanced technologies and sort of innovative things, right? We in the Army have a couple of different training classes. Ironically, when I got back to the Army, one of the classes that I now am mandated to take is a data analytics class, I'm waiting for the day where I get to go, because I'm fascinating to see if I just want to take it. I want to see what it's like, and I want to see what my peers are learning as other senior executives here in the Department of the Army. But on the flip side, what we don't have is data 101 training for our sergeants and majors and lieutenants and first, that. So I'm like, where is that in basic training, right? You learn how to march, right? You learn how to shoot, you learn how to put your weapon together, you need to learn how to take your weapon apart. Where are you getting that training saying how to use a computer, what it means to do proper data management, right? I voiced this in the Army already. It should not be a surprise to a lot of people, but it's a general sort of consensus thing. Tony said the tailoring, right, or the making it special. Let's allow people to progress at a pace in which they are capable of progressing, and start in a place in the story, in the book, where they need to start, rather than saying everyone must start at page 1 and finish on page 100 in 3 days. Right. That's not, I think we need to just be a little bit more open-minded about that.
Yes. Anybody else want to talk about the challenges of training? I think there's like multi-levels of different types of practitioners.
One thing I hear a lot from people I'm talking to across DoD is they don't know what they're looking for when it comes to responsible AI talent, more specifically than just AI talent, but what do they need on a project team to be able to execute the responsible AI toolkit? Like what expertise do they need, and where should they find that? Or should we be investing in upskilling existing talent to meet those RAI needs? So I think figuring out how to describe what we're looking for and how to attract or to upskill talent to fill those RAI needs is going to be really important across the DoD. And I also think part of it is also just getting the levels of resourcing investment for AI workforce development in general from across the DoD, because there are so many competing priorities for workforce development, and there's competing priorities for budget. And I think it's going to take a concerted effort from people across the department to invest in that workforce development and that hiring, so that we do have the talent that we need. And given all of the competing priorities, that's a challenge. And it's something that at CDAO we're thinking a lot about, and going out across the DoD and trying to have those conversations. But it is a challenge.
One thing I just want to pile on there to what Abby said, and I've been a champion of this for a long, long time, but we should not be training on AI and ML if you don't have basic training on data management and data governance, right? Understanding how to effectively create, manage, and dispose data is imperative to drive quality, and quality is imperative to driving a good outcome when it comes to artificial intelligence, machine learning. I see this all the time, where people want to jump into AI training because it's like the new cool buzzword. And when I go in and I want to talk to them about a data stewardship, or I want to talk to them about master data management, or I want to talk about logical data modeling, and they're literally, they get this look of like, what the heck are you talking about, right? Okay, but you can't have an intelligible conversation about data training sets with AI unless you understand where your data is coming from, and the fact that, we have a baseball card about a human being. Our person data model is represented by 36 different system and 300 plus individual data elements, right? So your model is going to run on that person baseball card, not on 36 individual systems simultaneously, right? So potentially, right? So I just want to kind of throw that out there.
And I think it's a good principle to say that you can do it with the people you have. And I spent a lot of time advising startup companies, and I hear them complain, "Oh, we really want to hire some PhDs in AI, but we can't get them because Facebook and Google got them all." Uh, and I tell them, well, that's like saying you want to open a restaurant and you need a PhD in stove design, right? That's not the person you need. You need someone who can operate the stove, not someone who's going to design a new one. Uh, and that's where most of the need is, and that you can do with the right educational programs and the people you have.
That's a good point.
Well, we're at final comments time. I don't know. This is the fastest hour and a half webinar I've ever done, I think. Maybe we can start off with Tony, kind of kick us off. We just have about a minute each. So just something left on the cutting room table or anything you want to emphasize.
So I'm going to push development of personnel, absolutely important. First and foremost, set it in the middle. You need informed persons if any of this policy or ethics stuff is going to work when it actually boots hit ground. Two, as Abby said, the notion that innovation and policy are at odds is strange to me, right? Policy and ethics make sure that innovation can continue to go at a safe and consistent pace so that you're not just running into dead walls and dead ends and shooting yourself in the foot every so often. And then the last thing, which nobody brought up, but I just want to put it out as the last thing, that the is-ought fallacy is real, and it is a thing that not enough people think about or encounter in their day. The is-ought fallacy it means that something is the case is not a necessary and sufficient condition that it ought to be the case. This is a small pushback on Joe, I think, maybe, right? Just because our current ethics might suggest that a system can be deployed in XYZ way does not mean that that is the ought of the ethical case, but it also works the other way. That something is the case should not give us comfort that it must continue to be the case. That something is now something does not mean we cannot do better in the future. So I just encourage you to never fall for the is-ought fallacy, to not think that innovation and rules are at odds, and to get the education you need to do your job right. Over.
Fantastic. Next we'll go with Mr. Sasala.
Hey, thanks, Tom. First off, I just want to thank everyone on the panel here. I found this very informative myself, and kudos to Abby and team. We had this term in the Navy, which anyone from the Navy would know, which is buoys, not barriers, right? We want to stay in the channel. We want to stay safe, and I think the toolkit and the Bill of Rights, in a certain extent, is giving us those boundaries, right? And so it is desperately needed. I think it is incumbent upon folks like myself and Joe and others to implement them for reals. And make them like the standard, the baseline. And I like what Tony said. Don't fear innovation. It's the fear of the unknown is always something that happens here. And I just think that I'll just leave with the DoD. This is an imperative, right? This is an existential crisis for the country and for the DoD to appropriately use this technology. And now is the time to capitalize on that. And we should certainly move out in earnest with our buoys, not barriers.
Well said. Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for everybody who put work into it. And thanks, Tony, for ending on a point of pushing back a little bit. I don't want to give people the impression that philosophers agree with each other that often. You got a lot of agreement here today, but that's pretty rare. And I just want to close kind of on my ethics soapbox that ethics is a commander's or a leader's responsibility. And so, I think that if I do my job well, then in some short number of years, we don't need a chief responsible AI ethics officer anymore, right? Because we embed responsible ethical practices in the unit level, just like we do with everything else. And so I'm not saying the challenges aren't real. It's real. We got to figure it out. But at the end of the day, leaders in this Department of the Air Force, and I would say in the DoD probably writ large, but in my institution, the Department of the Air Force, leaders are responsible for ethics. And so I look forward to figuring out how we're gonna do that, and getting commanders and leaders to the place where they're comfortable employing these systems, confident that they'll achieve ethical results.
Great. Peter, just real quick, we're running out of time. I'm getting booted here.
Yeah, so we all want to build systems that do the right thing. And for software systems, we got 50 years of great tools to do software development. And about 20 years ago, we decided maybe it's not the coding that's the most important, it's the data. And we got 20 years of tools to handle data. But in the last few years, we said, well, maybe the data and the software is the easy part, and the hard part is getting the objective right of what is it we're trying to optimize? What's our objective function or our utility function? And we don't yet have a set practice of how we define what it is that we want, what it is we're trying to achieve. And so I think building up that toolkit is going to be key to allow us to do the better job, to come to a consensus for what is it we're trying to do. If we can come to that consensus, then we can build it.
That's fantastic. And Abby, I'll give you the final word. It's almost like we need a community of interest around this, sponsored by the DoD. I don't know.
Yes, and we happen to have one that just started last month. So yeah, please do join that if you're interested. We'd love to have you. Our next meeting, we're focusing on data and model cards and transparency and notice and explanation tools. So really encourage people to join. So I want to just leave off by saying, I mentioned at the beginning, we just built this responsible AI toolkit, and I mentioned that we're really focused this year, this fiscal year, on validating that toolkit so that in the future it can be integrated at sort of all levels. And as Joe just mentioned, it's really important that that this kind of work can be done not just by us at CDAO or by Joe at Air Force CDAO, but by anyone who is working with AI systems. And so to make that possible, we need feedback from people who are actually doing AI development and deployment across the DoD. So if you are on an AI team and you want to partner with us to validate the toolkit, to provide feedback with us, we have resources we can devote to it. We just need to set up those partnerships. So reach out to me if you're interested in that. And just want to close with a big thank you to the organizers for setting this up, and really enjoyed the conversation and enjoyed hearing from all the other panelists. Thanks.
Great. I'm going to turn it over now to Colonel Hollingsworth. Sorry we ran just a minute late, but I think we got it in as best we can. Yeah,
Not a
Colonel
problem
Hollingsworth.
at all.
Yeah.
Yes, not a problem at all. It's great discussion, very informative, just as everyone said. And I want to personally thank all of the panelists. And we want to thank everyone for joining the first Innovation Connect for 2024 today. We're grateful for your continued support of DoD innovators and the DAF CDAO. We have several pioneering projects underway and anticipate featuring even more in 2024. Our next webinar will host the DAF Autonomy, Data, and AI Experimentation, also known as ADEX, on 8 February. To stay up to date on upcoming events and registration information, follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter, newly named X. Approved videos of our past events are available on the Department of the Air Force CDAO YouTube page. And as always, we welcome your recommendations for future Innovation Connect topics to our DAF CDAO communications mailbox. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again.